Dan Pearson is the designer who believes that gardens are always on the brink of being lost to nature. And that suits his style. He says it should be difficult to see where a garden stops and woodland begins.
We're in this very amazing position to be able to make a difference in terms of landscapes actually working better. The blending and the blurring and the desire to help people understand the more natural side of a landscape is something that has incredible value, becomes more and more important to the work.
In the Lake District, on the border between England and Scotland, nature had already started to reclaim Lowther Castle, abandoned in the 1950s, a romantic ruin by the time Dan Pearson was commissioned to create a garden unlike any other in Britain.
That feeling of discovery was wonderful, and I said, we're never going to be able to restore this garden to what it was before. Why don't we do something that's much more about the discovery of a forgotten garden?
The great boast of Lowther Castle was that it had one room for every day of the year. Home of the Lowthers, who can trace their line back to the Vikings, what you see was built by William Lowther, the first Earl of Lonsdale, between 1806 and 1812. William Wordsworth came here, as did Lady Langtry. Turner painted it, the Kaiser stayed, and successive earls and countesses of Lowther lived and entertained in the grand manner. This is what remains today, a picturesque ruin whose decay was hastened by its requisition by the army during the Second World War and the inability of the family to find a buyer for it afterwards. The furniture went in 1947, sold in situ, and in 1957 James Lowther removed the roof and many of the walls. It was the fate of scores of country houses across the land. And is this remnant of the romantic movement which James Lowther's son, Jim Lowther, he calls himself, has taken on?
All of that whole great movement of romance and the picturesque is what informed the design of this house and what informed the early period of gardens in the early 19th century when it was first built. Then the Yellow Earl, who became Earl towards about 1880, he took it in a different direction, ultimately using Thomas Mawson, the arts and crafts designer, with a series of gardens executed in the early 20th century, which were much more fussy. But, you know, always nature is kind of wanting to reclaim the place back.
If the house had been abandoned in 1957, the gardens had been let go as early as 1935, too expensive to keep up. For years, they were used as a chicken farm.
Lowther was an extraordinary project to be asked to work on because we were asked in before anything had really happened on the ground. So this site was very different from what it is today. It felt deeply melancholy and neglected and heavy, and the ruined castle, or the ruinized castle, and effectively the damage that his dad had done with unpicking the previous generation's opulence in a way was very, very tangible and visible. So the Sitka spruce planted over the whole 140-acre garden, the battery chicken farms on the lawn, the castle roof taken off, the perilousness of the castle itself, but it still felt extraordinary and rather wonderful.
When you hear the castle and its grounds described like that, it makes what Jim Lowther has done over the past 10 years all the more remarkable.
Dan and I probably spend as much time outside the site looking at it from outside, looking inwards, as we did actually within it. And I do remember he said two things. One is the strong geology of the site, because we sit on a bed of limestone here, and the bones of the landscape are really sort of evident because it pokes through. We've got limestone pavements and escarpments and so on. And he felt that it had very strong bones. And then the second thing he said is he thought the ruin behind us of the castle had a very good, strong relationship to the sky, and it spoke very well to the sky. It probably works better as a ruin than it ever did as a house. So we hit it off straight away.
So here they were, the custodian of the family castle and the landscape designer, on a mission to find and restore the lost gardens of Lowther and to reinterpret them for the 21st century.
That feeling of discovery was wonderful, and I said to Jim, why don't we're never going to be able to restore this garden to what it was before, because we looked at the old iterations of the grand formal gardens that had been there and always been overwhelmed by the magnitude of the landscape and the climate. And why don't we do something that's much more about the discovery of a forgotten garden?
3 houses have been on the site, and this is the third one. But the garden structure has remained the same over about 550 years. What I mean by that is the axial structure, the north-south meridian lines and the east-west lines, and of course the geology of the site, which is very strong, which is the western escarpment. So Dan's worked within that constraint, and what he's doing is he's populating the spaces that structure gives. And of course the castle itself, which we're borrowing ideas from the past, whereby we just let nature in a controlled fashion to occupy the walls and recolonise the spaces and to start spilling out the windows. And eventually, and in not too much time, because it's happening so rapidly now, it will look like an overgrown Pyrenean ruin.
Inspired scores of local volunteers to rally to the family's call for help in making this place a great attraction of Cumbria. A magic, too, which chimed exactly with the philosophy of Dan Pearson, who put together a master plan to accompany the application for a grant from the Heritage Lottery Fund in 2007 and was given the job of implementing it in 2011. Now it's being transferred from paper to place.
At Lowther, for instance, we really didn't want to erase the fact that nature had the upper hand. We wanted to insert ourselves very gently with the clearances and the horticulture, and just enough for the amount of people that are realistically going to be able to look after that place to make an impression that stops it being a frightening place and still allows it to be somewhere that breathes that history. And that balance struck, I think, is one of the things that makes a place magic.
So the master plan for Lowther Castle was set. And, perhaps not surprisingly for a castle, it may be a life's work.
We are sticking absolutely faithfully to that master plan, and we're just picking off all the bits within it, and we haven't changed our focus from that. I never intend to change designer. So long as we're both alive, you know, this partnership between me and Dan is going to carry on.
There is a cast of characters in Dan Pearson's life which helps us to understand his work. First, his mother and her vegetable patch. Then there was Miss Joy at Hill Cottage, the neighbour whose house Dan's family took on after she died.
That garden, which was just an acre that I was growing up in, but completely overgrown in the 70s, was hugely instructive to me, and the sort of deep romance of that place and that sense of history of needing to only tread as heavily as we needed to, because there was only us, our family, and that strong nature which was always pushing back. To learn that balance early on was very key.
There was Geraldine Noyes, a retired teacher in whose garden Dan learned which plants like to live together. And Mrs. Pumphrey, Dan Pearson's first Saturday job as a gardener.
Mrs. Pumphrey was a very, very good plantswoman and a good colourist. She was the equivalent of Beth Chatto in a way, you know, my local person. And so learning about good horticulture, I knew that that was really important, because those are your tools. That's what you work with. And if you're going to be able to express yourself in a fluid and confident way, you need to understand your tools or know how to play the instrument. So for me, I always knew that good horticulture was something that was going to be incredibly useful to me. I always knew that I wanted to not just grow plants, I wanted to put them together, because when you combine them, you then start to get moods or atmospheres or events in a year. But you need to understand how to do that to be able to combine them well. So the horticulture for me was really important. There was a point in my teens where I was just not enjoying school, because I wanted to be doing horticulture more, so I'd miss the school bus, you know, so I could spend a day in the garden. And that kind of developed. And there was a point where I was going to go to art college and just thought, I was talking about it with my mother, who taught in art colleges. And she said, well, why don't you follow your heart and do horticulture? And it was like a kind of being let off the hook, you know. I just thought, well, I said, maybe I shouldn't be putting all my eggs into one basket. She said, well, you can always come back to the art, you know, which of course is what I've done with the artistry of being a landscape designer.
Later, there would be the influences of Beth Chatto, whose work Dan first saw at Chelsea in 1976, a 2-year apprenticeship at Wisley, a year at Edinburgh Botanic Garden, a spell at Kew, and travel, lots of it. His mind is a cornucopia of images collected on his expeditions.
The wild places are always the places that inspire me most. When I was at the Edinburgh Botanics, I started going out to look at plants in their natural environments, and fell in with a group of friends, and we got a scholarship to go to the Picos de Europa, where I first saw plants that I'd been growing in the garden setting, growing in the wild on the mountainsides, first to the Pyrenees as we went through, and then up into the Picos. And I started travelling again and again to wild places, or places that had not been touched by man or gently by man, to understand the next layer of plantsmanship. You know, I'd learned about horticulture, growing them in a garden, but to understand how things grow in a wild setting is incredibly key. Once you see where things grow, what they're growing with and why, you never ever forget it. The world is a fascinating place, isn't it? And I think that you need to remain open and inquisitive and fluid as a result of that openness, to be able to channel the best out of a site, out of a place, out of a conversation, out of bringing all those things together. Some of those things might be totally practical, some of those things might be an idea that might simply kick off the end result. You know, it might never be visible, the original idea. But I think to be open to that conversation going this way or that way, and the process being something that remains open as well, I think that that is very, very key. What we're in when we're making landscape and gardens is we are in process. They are never finished. We finish stages and then they're allowed to evolve, but the best places are never static. They're constantly moving, and I think to be open, to allow yourself to be part of that process, allows a lot more to come to the fore in terms of being able to pin down the best from each place.
And yet, like many garden designers, Dan Pearson admits to being charmed by the arts and crafts period, the formality of the architecture of Lutyens, Voysey and others, the gardens of Gertrude Jekyll, Vita Sackville West. He's just finished recreating part of the garden at Sissinghurst in Kent, which Vita and her husband Harold Nicholson made over 30 years. A part dedicated to plants of the Mediterranean, which they'd seen on a visit to the Greek island of Delos. He recognises that all gardens require some formal areas. But in his projects, this one is in Devon, you can see the balance between formal and informal, a balance which is different from that struck by many other landscape designers.
One of the things that probably is very particular about British gardening, we're very good at that juxtaposition and tension between formality and informality, and it's something that certainly in the last 150 years, you know, has become an aesthetic. When you put the two together, you get that wonderful tension. A wild place, by simply mowing a path into it, there's a formality even in just doing that. It stops the wild place being impenetrable to the mind. It allows you access physically and mentally. It's a tool, it's a really interesting tool, that formality and formality juxtaposition, and it's something that I'm interested in playing with, because if you weight it, the informality of my gardens is the greater part always. The way that I approach space is informal. It's not just the aesthetic, it's an approach to it. It's a natural, fluid way into a place. It's about how you access it in an informal way, and it's not necessarily obviously prescribed. And then the smaller part of it is the formality, but it's always there. There are always strong bones. There's always clarity in the bone structure that allows you an intuitive understanding of how you're supposed to negotiate a place, or how something is framed and revealed.
The garden in Devon is large, and that's given Dan Pearson room to strike the balance that is his trademark. But at King's Cross Station in London, there wasn't that luxury. Yet, in a confined space, he was determined to bring people as close to nature as possible. And what he achieved was to prove its worth as parks, not only in London but up and down the country, assumed a new importance in people's lives.
The function of the place comes absolutely foremost. How you move through the space, how you occupy numbers of people, how you make places that are not dead ends, that always breathe and keep fluidity of movement of people. All those things, the bone structure there is absolutely imperative that that all works, and that we meet the demands of a place that in the summer, because it's now a very successful green space, is inundated with people who, particularly since the pandemic, are drawn to green space, even if they don't necessarily go to it for the gardens. They just know that those places make you feel better. So we have to accommodate them. The informality of the planting, for instance, juxtaposed with that very formal approach to the way that we move through the places and the dwell places, the lawns, the places where people can sit. There's this very nice feeling of people can go there and they can just let their hair down because actually the planting in the beds is relaxed. It just makes you feel easy. It doesn't keep that tension of the infrastructure of London going. It's like, okay, now we can relax. And the planting there, I think, has perhaps more resonance for being very strongly juxtaposed to the formality of those buildings and the function of the place.
It may be difficult to find a British garden designer who hasn't been influenced by the gardens of Italy. Few, though, have been given the opportunity to create one in Italy itself, on a grand scale. This is Torrecchia Vecchia near Rome, once part of the estate of a great Roman family, then various popes, including the Borgias, and from 1991, Prince Carlo Caracciolo di Castagneto, who bought it sight unseen, and commissioned Dan Pearson to create an English garden for him and his wife, Violante Visconti.
She was very, very clear with me that she wanted a garden that was felt like it had been overwhelmed by nature. You couldn't tell whether it was almost been gardened. And she took me to Ninfa to say, look, this is the kind of mood that I'm looking for. It was just 5 kilometers away, and it was also, of course, a ruined town that had been overlaid by a garden which then occupied the ruins in the way that the people once did. But with a garden, of course, it had grown into the ruins and overlaid them with this incredible patina. Ninfa, of course, is one of those places that just sings. It has a magic that is very hard to pin down. I was allowed to wander around the garden at twilight on my own with fireflies that were gliding over that river that slips through underneath the Roman bridge in May when the roses were at their most prolific and cascading. It was just somewhere that made tingles run up the back of your neck. It was completely, the sum of its parts are sort of greater than when you try to analyse what it actually is.
Dan Pearson immediately made a connection between the project at Torrecchia Vecchia and his childhood home of Hill Cottage. After all, wasn't this just another overgrown house and garden at which nature had got the upper hand and had to be tamed? In one sense, yes. But in another, no. Scale.
There was a point in my probably early 30s where I stopped being afraid of scale, and I just felt really comfortable working at whatever scale I needed to work at. Violanta's vision was a big one. I didn't know it then, but she had a limited amount of time to live. She said, I want the garden quickly. I'm in my mid-60s, I want it fast. So we were able to work in a very kind of immediate way, and we brought in big trees and new cork oaks and just worked on it in a very kind of immediate and responsive way. One of the things that I've always felt is important is that you should follow your intuition, and the work always comes out of good intuition, I think. And then you analyse your intuition and make it work to provide you with the structure and the function, but it often comes out of those first impressions. We're in this very amazing position to be able to make a difference in terms of landscapes actually working better. So the blending and the blurring and the desire to help people understand that the more natural side of a landscape is something that has incredible value becomes more and more important to the work. The biodiversity that can exist within and alongside a garden, and the blurring of the ecology that can come and go and breathe in and out between a cultivated space and a less cultivated space. You know, all those things become very fluid and important.
It may be that Dan Pearson's work at Torrecchia Vecchia is the closest he's come to creating a spiritual place. He says he doesn't believe in an afterlife, yet his conversation is peppered with the word spiritual. One of his books is called Spirit. He certainly believes in the spirit of place, that unique weave of culture, of stories, history, memories.
When you can take people somewhere in a garden through immersing them in an environment wholeheartedly and properly and quietly, because my work is quiet, you can unleash a whole different thought process. You can make people feel grounded because they're connected in a sensory way, which is often subliminal. And when people touch down, they can make a leap that allows them to think more wholeheartedly about where they are, what matters. It is esoteric. I'm not setting out to do that. I'm setting out to make places that make you feel in tune. And when people say that they've been taken somewhere by those places, I know that I've done my job properly. The subliminal, I think, is really an important part of why those places have a spiritual connection.
It's this approach to landscape, in the case of Torrecchia Vecchia, a landscape unchanged for hundreds of years, that makes Dan Pearson an artist, though he's worried that the British don't see his profession in that light. But he accepts that much of what he does is naturalistic and painterly, his words, and that it really is art.
If we were in America, I would call myself an artist and not worry about it, but I think in this country we feel we've got to earn that title. And we go through exactly the same process of analysing our thoughts, analysing a place, the crossover between places and ideas, and form and function, and all those things that have to come together to make somewhere sing it's an artistic process. So yes, it is absolutely an art form. That intuitive understanding of land and the toolbox that we have to make things work is deeply practical, but there's also a cerebral level to it as well, which means that it then becomes an art form.
On the border of England and Scotland, Lowther Castle has a new life. It will never again be the great house where royalty stayed and the Lowthers lived in style. But nor will it be the forlorn wreck with a chicken farm on its lawns. It is instead a place for everyone.
Of course, it was a private house before, and I think private houses quite often beg a landscape design answer which is more manicured and more tamed. This public project is a deliberate way of trying to inform people about the wider landscape of this poetic, romantic Lake District that lies around us, and bringing that down in a scaled down form into this enclosed space. And Dan's done a fantastic job.
Now, thousands visit every year. Dan Pearson keeps coming back. A rose garden he designed was opened in 2021. And every time he does, he's reminded of the hours he and Jim Lowther spent poring over the archives in search of inspiration.
We look back at lots of material photographs of the garden in its heyday, or one of its heydays, the most recent heyday, and took from that really a kind of they were interesting pointers, but possibly no more than that. We didn't necessarily want to rework the Japanese garden in the way that it was then, because it was a pastiche of a Japanese garden. It was nothing like the gardens I know from Japan, having been there myself. So we took the ideas of the places and sort of keyed into, say, the sweet-scented garden, the rockery, the Japanese garden, and then thought about ways of allowing people to imagine those places through reworking them very gently.
In its heyday, Lowther Castle could afford a large staff, including gardeners. It was, of course, fashionable to have formal gardens, if nothing else to welcome guests who expected to see them. So, how did Dan Pearson reconcile that manicuring with his preference for naturalistic gardens?
I think I've always been very interested in that juxtaposition, really, between the desire to tend and to manage, and that horticultural desire, balanced with finding the right balance that if you do it just enough and let nature have just as much of a say as it needs to, you get this wonderful synergy happening, and the sense of place in that old garden as a result of us not wading in and removing that patina and time and age and history was very magical. So I learned many things from that garden: the balance, the importance of sense of place, and sense of place is absolutely pivotal to every piece of work that I do. So what I try and do at the beginning of a project is to absorb what's happening with the feeling of a place, and then analyse why a place makes you feel that way, and then I will find ways of tuning it up. And that really is very much part of the design process, so that you can help people to be part of it, reveal it more.
We should not forget Ninfa. Dan Pearson always knew about it, of course. Jim Lowther came to it afresh. But both agreed that what had been done in Italy would guide them in their work at Lowther Castle.
I get a real kick out of hearing the public being here, hearing the shouts of children, watching people play football on these big expansive lawns that we've created. In fact, when I said to Dan I wanted him to turn our courtyard into a piazza, and he did, and we had an awful lot of fun doing it. One day I had my window open in my office, which looks down into this space, and I heard some Italian voices, and lo and behold, I looked down, and sitting around the table with some Italians drinking beers, and I thought, we really have arrived, you know.
Dan Pearson's work at Lowther has been inspirational, not just to those who visit, but also to Jim Lowther himself. Suddenly, he saw that his family's castle could be part of a bigger idea.
The garden itself has been a catalyst for Jim now to do this huge rewilding project of the surrounding parkland, which is going to become an enormous hub of biodiversity, which is already just exploding what's happening there. His role, his tenure as the custodian for that land is going to be a really, really important one for the future. And if all those estates and even small gardens start to join up across the country, we're beginning to make a real difference.
For Dan Pearson, the most pleasing aspect of the scheme in Cumbria is the number of people who see it of every age. It vindicates his belief that we all need open space, greenery, plants, a connection with the natural world. It works at Lowther Castle, and he's found that it works in all the gardens which have filled his stellar career as one of Britain's leading designers.
I went to see a client last night. We had dinner, and she was just saying how differently her kids use the garden from their parents, for instance, who are in their 80s. How it's a different place for each of them. It means something different. What we've created there is a place that enables people to touch down in lots of different ways. Yeah, it's very rewarding.
In the end, Dan Pearson has never forgotten the help of his mother and father, of Mrs. Pumphrey, who gave him his Saturday job, and of Geraldine Noyes, the retired teacher who brought back exotic plants from trips overseas in her Morris Minor and encouraged him to enter the village garden show. It was a childhood which ensured that the garden would be central to his life.
Gardens they will never cease to be fascinating places for me. They really do feel every bit as moving as being taken somewhere by a painting or a piece of music or a sculpture. Being moved literally and taken somewhere else is really the ultimate aim.
Next time, there is a life's work in the portfolio of garden designer Arabella Lennox-Boyd. 6 gold medals at Chelsea, 50 years of creating gardens for everyone from the Duke of Westminster to Sting and Trudy Styler. 50 years in which every new garden has been, and continues to be, a discovery.
It's a whole new world of adventure and of fun, because I think that gardening should be fun. Even designing a tiny garden, I want to have fun.
Trained in London, Arabella Lennox-Boyd came to see the importance of observation. Her life has taken her to gardens in Europe, Japan, China, and the Islamic world. Those influenced her work, public and private. But a little part of her will forever be where she was born and grew up, Italy.
What I liked was the wilderness around us and the natural landscape. That was my connection. It was really with the wildflowers and nature. One has to be in contact with nature. I think nature teaches you so much.
Phần hầm hiu ôi buồn thiêu sao điều hiu, ruộng sâu chân dưỡng nôi sầu bao trái dầu lệ ứa hai hàng, lệ ứa hai hàng loan phượng đôi đàn lìa tan. Cái gì đây? Tao nói rồi, khi nào tao ngủ ngon thì tao mới chúc ngủ ngon. Còn lâu tao mới ngủ ngon nha mày. Tao giật mình cũng được á. Tao nói rồi, khi nào tao ngủ ngon thì tao mới chúc ngủ ngon. Còn lâu tao mới ngủ ngon nha mày. Bớt chúc đi. Chúc ngủ ngon. Ngon, 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 ngon. Ngon, 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 ngon. Ngon, 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 ngon. Ngon, 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 ngon. Ngon, 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 ngon. Ngon, 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 ngon. Ngon, 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 ngon. Ngon, 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 ngon. Chúc ngủ ngon. Ngon, ngon, ngon. Chúc ngủ ngon. Chúc, chúc, chúc. Chúc ngủ ngon. Ngon, ngon, ngon. Chúc ngủ ngon. Chúc, chúc.
Next time, there is a life's work in the portfolio of garden designer Arabella Lennox-Boyd. 6 gold medals at Chelsea, 50 years of creating gardens for everyone from the Duke of Westminster to Sting and Trudy Styler. 50 years in which every new garden has been, and continues to be, a discovery.
It's a whole new world of adventure and of fun, because I think that gardening should be fun. Even designing a tiny garden, I want to have fun.
Trained in London, Arabella Lennox-Boyd came to see the importance of observation. Her life has taken her to gardens in Europe, Japan, China, and the Islamic world. Those influenced her work, public and private. But a little part of her will forever be where she was born and grew up, Italy.
What I liked was the wilderness around us and the natural landscape. That was my connection. It was really with the wildflowers and nature. One has to be in contact with nature. I think nature teaches you so much.